Tyrone was my son. He was a family man, you know. And I see him laying there, and I go to him, but he's not responsive or nothing. And I'm, Tyrone, you okay? Tyrone, talk to me.
People were yelling, screaming, arguing. Police had no idea what had happened.
They kind of put two and two together that he got pinned against the wall.
She is completely in shock, and she's yelling, "Get up, Tyrone, get up, please, get up."
He would have marks on him from prior fights. They were in a tumultuous relationship.
I wound up getting in touch with Homicide and told them I have everything on film.
That video pretty much told the entire story.
She said, "You are not going to walk away from me," and the worst happened.
It's Thanksgiving weekend 2011 in Philadelphia. At almost 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, multiple calls come into 911 from the 2400 block of Moore Street in South Philly.
Officers are working during Thanksgiving holiday. The peaceful quietness is disturbed by several 911 calls coming in. A report of a car that struck a building nearby in the South Philadelphia area. Officers don't have information as to how many people are hurt, how significant this crash is, so they're responding to the scene, not sure what they're going to come up upon when they arrive.
I thought it was an auto accident with injuries, which I've dealt with thousands of times.
The responding officers find a chaotic scene.
This crash was so loud that people in the neighborhood came rushing outside immediately.
I see this car in the middle of a lot that apparently went through like a barnyard fence.
It appears the vehicle then struck the brick wall of a townhouse.
The wall had chips in the brick, which I thought were from the impact of the car. It was probably about 5 to 10 feet from the side of a house. Just sitting there with the headlights on.
Officers push through the crowd to get closer.
I got people out right now yelling and screaming and stuff like this, and I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, what happened?
There are no occupants inside the vehicle, but they spot a man lying on the ground in front of it.
There is one man that suffered significant injuries. He was hit by this car and pushed into the wall.
They kind of put two and two together that he got pinned against the wall, and then the car backed out and he just fell over.
What brought people out on the street is the noise. You hear that crash. It's a very distinctive noise, especially when it's hitting brick. The people that were coming outside, these were actually relatives and close friends, so they were able to quickly tell police who the victim was. They identified him as Tyrone.
A woman kneels on the ground, cradling 28-year-old Tyrone Taylor in her arms.
Police realized that this woman is Tyrone's wife, Keisha Jones.
She is completely in shock, and she's yelling, "Get up, Tyrone, get up, please, get up."
Tyrone Taylor Jr. was born on June 29, 1983. He was raised in South Philly.
Tyrone Taylor came from a huge, loving family. He was one of many siblings.
My son Tyrone, he was a wonderful child. He was a good big brother. He took his little ones underhand and, he taught them and, they got along very well with his sisters and brothers. He was very well liked. Everyone loved Tyrone.
Tyrone graduated from Southern High School. He was a responsible young man. He went into the workforce.
Tyrone began working construction jobs, but dreamed of one day becoming a detective.
he just, he started doing his own thing, which was a good thing. He worked it. And I was just very proud of him.
Because Tyrone was such a fun personality, he really got along with people. And by people, he was really a great bachelor. He loved his time with the ladies.
Then next thing you know, he tells me I'm going to be a grandfather. So I was happy about that.
He had a great time as a young man. He also had a few children along the way, but he hadn't really settled down. He always was waiting for the right one to come along that he could really build a life with.
In 2004, Tyrone met the stunning 23-year-old Keisha Jones.
He was really attracted to her beauty, but she was a single mother of 2 children, and he really fell in love with the way she loved her children and mothered them.
Tyrone also loved Keisha's children.
Tyrone stepped into Keisha's life, and her life became easier. He made it better for not only her, but for the children as well.
They were inseparable. They spent every minute together, and within 3 months, they were engaged.
Just a short time later, they found out that Keisha was pregnant. And not only was she pregnant, but she was pregnant with twins.
But the happiness was short-lived.
The future looked so bright for these two until something from Tyrone's past caught up with him, and he ended up in jail.
He was in possession of a controlled substance, something that I might add is legal now in this year, but Tyrone was arrested and sent to county jail.
Now, it was only a few months, but it really put a major stress on Keisha. She was going back and forth visiting him, trying to figure out how she could help him, and also wondering how is she going to raise 2 babies alone?
So this is a man that went from working every day caring for his family to having to sit still for 4 months' time while his woman, his fiance, was on the outside being a mom, holding it down for him, and pregnant at the same time.
While Tyrone was away, Keisha went into labor. 3 months early.
Her twins were born. One left fighting for her life, and her second twin actually passed away.
Soon after the birth of her baby girl, who turned out to be healthy and happy, Tyrone was trying so hard to make it up to her, and he did everything in his power to be a wonderful father and provider.
In 2007, Tyrone and Keisha welcomed another child into the world. He had a son, and he was there for Keisha, and he was there as the father and took care of his family. In 2008, they finally made it to the altar and got married in Vegas.
He was a family man, He did what he had to do.
But just 3 years later, Keisha holds Tyrone in her arms as he fights for his life after being hit by a vehicle. An ambulance arrives. EMTs recognize that his injuries are life-threatening.
So they're giving CPR, trying to save this man's life at this point.
Patrol officers try to keep the crowd at bay.
It's a chaotic scene, especially in this case because he did live in the neighborhood. He had family in the neighborhood. So they came out right away.
I was laying up in the bed, actually asleep, and somebody was beating on my door. It was my brother, and he told me Tyrone was hit by a car. So I throw my clothes on and I rush around there, and I see him laying there, and I go to him, and he's not responsive or nothing, and I'm, Tyrone, you okay? Tyrone, talk to me. And then the cops come and they tell me to back up.
It was just getting crazy out there. It was just getting crazy. So I called for more units.
There's people arguing, there's people out in the street. At this point, you don't know who's hurt, who's involved in this crash, who's responsible for the crash.
As detectives, we have to try to be aware of that because we need to get our job done and keep the scene secure, but we have to understand that there's, high emotions out there.
As the officers try to control the chaos, they hear a recurring call from the crowd.
They're yelling. They're saying things like, "She did this. She hit him. We can't believe she killed him."
In the early morning hours of November 27th, 2011, police are on the scene of a car crash in South Philly that left Tyrone Taylor gravely injured.
He was hit by this car and pushed into the wall.
And there was a vehicle, it was about maybe 10 feet away from the wall. And there was the victim lying on the ground, obviously suffered severe trauma.
There was so many people out there. Everybody in the neighborhood. And they crying and, oh my God.
EMTs do their best to save him. But Tyrone's injuries are too severe.
He was laying on his back and just saw the breath just coming up, like not with a burst of air. It was just seeping out of his mouth, and checked for a pulse, and there was no pulse there. So at that point, I'm like, he's not with us any longer.
Tyrone had suffered such severe injuries when that vehicle hit him that he was already dead.
The realization that Tyrone is gone spreads through the crowd.
This is the neighborhood that he grew up in, and these people are angry.
Especially Tyrone's father.
Officers were holding him back. Oh, I'd be livid too. You know what I'm saying? No doubt Dad was being held back.
It took a lot to hold me back. Took plenty of cops, and everybody was like going crazy.
They're yelling. They're saying things like, "She did this. She hit him. We can't believe she killed him." And police realize that the woman that they're speaking of is Tyrone's wife, Keisha Jones.
The officers, fearing for her safety, also realize that Keisha's hurt.
Keisha is rushed to the hospital because there's blood on her hands and her knees, and they're not sure if she was injured in the accident.
Detectives arrive.
The initial officers that went to the scene try to sort things out. They try to get things under control. So we go and handle the scene.
Luckily, the vehicle's still on the scene. So reason would tell you that probably the driver's still on the scene. And the most alarming thing is the possibility that somebody could walk away. If you do have a crime, that driver could have fled or could walk away while you're standing there talking to other people. So at this point, you need officers on the scene to contain everybody that's there.
Before they start talking to witnesses, detectives take a look at the vehicle and surrounding debris.
This was a very contained crime scene. There was apparently a mirror or some glass that was in that side lot. And when the car hit it, it broke the glass. There's damage, heavy damage to the front of the vehicle. There's damage to the wall of the row house. There's a big cement piece that was out.
This man that clearly was crushed by this vehicle. The vehicle struck him, pushed him into the wall of this building. But now they have to determine what exactly happened here.
Detectives work their way through the crowd.
They try to find out who the witnesses are.
But despite throngs of onlookers, detectives learn that no one actually saw what happened.
Because this accident happened so late at night, in the neighborhood, people were asleep. There's no one outside. There were no witnesses.
Then they spot a young woman sitting alone on the curb.
She kind of separated herself. She went around the corner and put her head down. She was sobbing.
She is distraught. She is upset. She's crying. So did she see what exactly happened? They go up and talk to her, and what she says is that she's Keisha's cousin, Tamara Stanford. She was actually in the back seat of the car, so she saw what happened. And when police interview Tamara, she gives a statement that's very clear.
The cousin says that Keisha was driving the car.
Detectives are on the scene of a fatal car crash in South Philly that left Tyrone Taylor dead.
When police got to the scene, it was too late. Tyrone was already gone. Police know they have to start asking questions to see why this man is dead on the ground this particular night.
Witness Tamara Stanford identifies the driver of the vehicle that hit Tyrone as his wife, Keisha Jones.
She was in the car with the driver when this was going on. So she saw it.
At that point, she's taken down to the homicide unit, where detectives will talk to her.
Back at the hospital, the cuts to Keisha's knees and hands are deemed superficial.
There was a mirror at the scene. That's the side of the house. And when the vehicle went up into the yard, it hit the glass, shattered the glass, and so there was glass all over the ground. That's the glass that Keisha was kneeling in.
It turns out it's from kneeling down next to Tyrone's lifeless body that her hands and her knees have lacerations in them.
After Keisha is taken to the hospital and treated for her injuries, they immediately take her to the police station. Police need to know what exactly happened.
The detectives deliver the awful news that Tyrone is indeed dead. She heard this at the scene, but she really didn't believe it. She's just shocked that Tyrone is truly gone.
Keisha confirms she was driving the vehicle when it hit Tyrone.
This was the father of her children. This was the man that she loved. And Keisha professed to tell police just that this wasn't intentional. This was an accident.
There was an argument in the car. Tyrone got out and she jumped into the driver's seat and started to go after him.
Keisha explains that she tried to take her foot off the gas pedal, but her shoe got caught.
Her heel got stuck in the vehicle's gas pedal, and this was an accident.
But when police ask a follow-up question, Keisha's answer takes them by surprise.
Police ask Keisha, "Have you ever chased Tyrone with a car before?" And they're shocked when she says yes.
Keisha Jones admitted to chasing Tyrone down before. They would argue, it would get undoubtedly heated. Tyrone would remove himself from the situation and leave. And Keisha, being the one not wanting that argument to end, would jump in her car and go chase Tyrone. She goes on to admit that, I've chased him 2 or 3 times before in the car and nothing bad ever happened.
That makes it suspicious, so we have to go out there and see if she didn't intentionally mean to kill him.
Detectives turn to the only other witness, Keisha's cousin, Tamara.
When the vehicle hit Tyrone, Tamara was in the back seat.
She tells detectives that she had been out at a bar that evening with Keisha and Tyrone.
The argument was actually over infidelity. Tyrone saw Keisha getting a phone number of another guy while they were in the bar, and this upset Tyrone.
She says that they were still arguing in the car on the way home.
Tyrone was the one driving. She wasn't paying attention to Keisha and Tyrone because this was an argument. This was the norm for Keisha and Tyrone. And Tamara just sat back like, here we go again, and paid them no attention.
The argument got heated, and Keisha kicked Tyrone out of the car.
Tyrone was in his neighborhood. He figured everything blew up. It was out of control. He was going to remove himself from the situation. He left Keisha the vehicle so she could then go to her house with their children, and he would catch up with her after the situation de-escalated and everybody calmed down and had a chance to think. Tamara said she looked up from the phone because suddenly the vehicle started going really fast.
She realized that Keisha is driving forward at a high rate of speed and coming right at Tyrone.
Keisha proceeded to hit Tyrone. When she hit Tyrone, Tyrone rolled on top of the vehicle. Keisha proceeded to then accelerate and ran Tyrone into a wall, thereby crushing him.
She backs away from the building, and our witness sees the victim at that point on the ground after he's been hit. She sees Keisha get out of the car and approach Tyrone.
She said she got out of the car and was saying, Keisha, why did you do that? Why did you do that? She was very adamant. She just felt it was wrong as to what Keisha did.
Police now have two conflicting statements.
That still doesn't mean that Keisha did it on purpose. I mean, she might have just got out of the car and that things just went a little too far as her driving. In this case, it wasn't a whodunit because she admitted that she was driving the vehicle and never disputed that. It was a matter of the intent.
Philadelphia detectives are investigating the suspicious death of Tyrone Taylor after his wife hit him with her car in November of 2011.
Police are at a standstill. They have Keisha saying it was an accident. They have Keisha's cousin, Tamara, saying it wasn't an accident. There's no evidentiary support.
With no proof either way, detectives take a closer look at the facts they do have.
Tamara is telling police Keisha came to pick her up. They came to meet Tyrone. It was a regular fun night. They had dinner, they went out. Keisha had 2 drinks for the night.
Keisha's blood alcohol is tested, and she ends up being just over 0.1, which is just over the legal limit in Pennsylvania. The problem that you have as an investigator and as a prosecutor is that there is some level of intoxication. 2 drinks may have brought you over that legal limit depending on the size of that person or the weight of that person. So she could have been significantly intoxicated or just a little bit intoxicated. Did this come into play, that attacks that she intentionally rammed him into a wall and killed him?
Investigators question the families to learn more about Tyrone and Keisha's relationship.
From the outside looking in, it looked like they were one big happy family, and Tyrone and Keisha got along so well.
But they all agree that the death of one of their twins while Tyrone was in jail was a curveball.
These were 2 people suffering from grief. Keisha especially because she was a mother that lost a child, and Tyrone, feeling guilty for not having been there, just tried to be there for Keisha as much as possible.
This trauma never really left Keisha, and she was always wondering what would have happened if the situation was different.
Is this crash payback? Is she getting revenge on the loss that Tyrone caused her to suffer?
The family says that in the past, Keisha often took her grief and her anger out on Tyrone.
He felt himself responsible for making that mistake, and it was because of that Keisha's anger bubbled over repeatedly, and Tyrone took the abuse. Keisha was prone to lash out verbally, physically, and Tyrone never retaliated. He never lifted a hand to her. He just kind of dealt with it.
They're always fighting. He would have marks on him from prior fights. They were in a tumultuous relationship.
I start noticing scratches and different things, which he never been into an abusive relationship with anyone. And for me starting to see him like this is, it just bothered me when I say something, but he's like, oh, Dad, it's not like that. I got this. Don't worry about it.
Men that are in domestic violence situations tend to stay silent. They don't tell anyone about it.
Men will not go down and get a protection from abuse order, better known as a PFA, against their wife or girlfriend. It's a man thing.
But even if Keisha had been violent to Tyrone in the past, it doesn't prove her intent on the night he was killed. The day after the crash, Tyrone's father calls the station.
I wound up getting in touch with a homicide and told them that I had footage of the incident that happened. My son was killed last night and he was hit by the car. And I have everything on film.
A lot of the corner stores, or as they call them in Philadelphia, bodegas, were very camered up. They would have cameras front, side, back, the whole thing. So there was a corner store about a half a block away, that had cameras that pointed directly at the scene.
Tyrone's father tells them he went to the store that morning.
When he seen me come in there, he's like, I know what you're here for. And he's like, turned the camera around and showed it to me. I asked him, is it possible I can get a copy of it? He gave me a copy of it.
Detectives realize that they have the video that involves the whole crash. Eyewitnesses, video, audio, anything that you can get that was recorded is going to be ideal because that is the most subjective item that you can have in your investigation.
When we got that video and saw that video, it pretty much told the entire story.
What you see on the surveillance video doesn't exactly match Keisha's story.
Philadelphia detectives are looking into the fatal crash that killed 28-year-old Tyrone Taylor on Thanksgiving weekend 2011. Tyrone's wife, Keisha, hit him with the vehicle she was driving, pinning him against a brick wall.
Keisha told police that this was an accident. There's no way she would ever dream of killing her husband.
After being tipped off by Tyrone's father, detectives obtained camera footage from a bodega near the crash site. Detectives review the footage, zeroing in on the moment the vehicle comes into frame.
It pretty much told the entire story. You see the car come up, you see the headlights of the car come to the side, you see Tyrone get out, he's walking across the front of the car.
He doesn't slam the door. He doesn't give her the finger. He doesn't bang on the glass. He doesn't exhibit any signs that he's hopped up or he's violent or he's angry.
Tyrone attempts to walk away, but Keisha gets behind the wheel.
Suddenly, the car lurches forward and turns, makes a 90-degree turn directly aimed at Tyrone.
It's a sharp 90-degree turn at a high rate of speed. And from another camera, you see Tyrone is now, he flips up on the hood of the car as the car continues into the wall. Camera doesn't show where the wall hits, but you see the car hit into the wall, kind of bangs, comes back, and then you see reverse. So once you see that, it's hard to say that you didn't see him or you didn't go after him.
What detectives see contradicts Keisha's explanation.
She said her heel got caught under the gas pedal, and that is not the case. She accelerated. If your heel really did get caught, there's no way for you to depress that gas pedal even more. It was at that moment police were sure that Keisha Jones killed her husband. This was a woman that killed her husband in rage.
For investigators, the video makes it clear how to charge Keisha.
Detectives charged Keisha with first-degree murder, which in Pennsylvania, you have to prove that I understood what I did was going to kill you, and I intended to do this to kill you. Going forward and accelerating, it looks like from the video that your motive is to hurt him, is to kill him at that point.
On November 27th, she was sent straight to prison without bail.
Keisha's attorney tries to get the first-degree murder charge downgraded.
At the end of that preliminary hearing, I said, I want to get you a deal for either manslaughter or third degree. Manslaughter is the best I could do. Third degree is the most likely, because third degree murder in Pennsylvania is that you were trying to inflict serious bodily injury, but not kill the person. And I believe that's what happened here.
Prosecutors consider the challenges of proving Keisha's intent beyond a reasonable doubt.
She stayed there, she didn't flee, and she was crying, holding him as he died in her arms. This is a huge hurdle as a prosecutor that you have to overcome. So you have a lot of issues going on here. Keisha was intoxicated. She was over the legal limit. Another thing that you look at is, was this in the heat of passion? So did she intentionally want to chase him, but she didn't intentionally want to kill him? Heat of passion takes away the intent of first-degree murder. So as a plea deal, they offered her to plead guilty to third-degree murder.
So we got that deal. It was for a lot of jail time. I believe it was for like 15 to 30 years, which is a tough pill to swallow, but it's better than life without parole. And I told her, if you get first degree, the most likely verdict here, none of it's going to matter because it's mandatory life. In Pennsylvania, there's no possibility of parole. And that's got to be a factor in deciding whether or not to take a deal. And I really tried to drive that home. I told her to take it, and she just didn't want to listen. She rejected it, and I just left the case.
Keisha felt confident that she would be successful in front of a jury.
On October 23, 2012, less than 1 year after the tragic death of Tyrone Taylor, his wife Keisha Jones goes on trial for first-degree murder.
There's 4 pieces of evidence in this case that were overwhelming. The video, the cousin, the video, and the cousin.
The prosecution puts Tamara on the stand.
That night when Keisha and her cousin and Tyrone went out, Tyrone became angry because he saw Keisha giving her phone number to another man at the bar.
According to Tamara, they were fighting in the car. The argument got heated, and Keisha kicked Tyrone out of the car.
What Tamara sees next is that Keisha gets into the driver's seat and floors it. She hits the gas, coming right towards Tyrone, eventually crashing into the side of the building, killing Tyrone. Her information is what also gave a clear intent, what took away the possibility that this was some kind of freak accident, that Keisha didn't intend to do this.
The video backs up Tamara's testimony.
They played it, and you seen the jurors in there looking and crying, and when they see the impact. You see them like all that and the whole motion of the jury. You know, it was like horrible.
Keisha had the opportunity to stop the car, to step on the brake. If indeed her heel was stuck the way Keisha claimed to police, she could have popped the emergency brake. She could have thrown the gear shift in park. She could have turned left. She could have turned the wheel. She could have gotten away from her husband. Instead, what this woman did was watch her husband roll on top of this vehicle, and then she accelerated into a wall, thereby crushing her husband to death.
The problem that you have in this case is you have this clear-cut video of this person driving 32 feet with her husband on the hood of the car through a fence into a brick wall. The only way you're going to overcome that is to have your client up there crying, appearing as to be the caring mother and the caring wife.
Which is exactly what the defense attempts to do.
The defendant could testify, and in this case, she did. You have Keisha saying one thing, that they have a beautiful relationship, no problem in the marriage. There's no reason in the world she would want to crush him.
She says she didn't do it intentionally, and she can prove that she didn't do it intentionally because she stayed there, she didn't flee, and she was crying, holding him as he died in her arms.
After a 3-day trial, the jury comes back with a verdict.
Despite the defense's claim that Keisha did not intend to kill her husband or even hurt him, Keisha was still found guilty and convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison.
The prosecution had a video. This video was amazingly detailed. It showed the car basically revving and crushing him. And she has her own cousin in the back seat testifying against her.
The outcome I was happy with. The sentence I was very happy with. He got justice. It wasn't so much I got justice, my son got justice. Tyrone Taylor.
She took his life viciously, maliciously. Not only did she ruin her life in the process, but what about those children? Now, they have no parents because of one moment in Keisha's mind.
Had they gotten help, had they sought therapy, had they talked it out with family even, just someone that meant something to them that could help them work through the issues, because it's never okay to hit anyone, male or female. If you are in an abusive relationship, it is not healthy. That is a toxic situation. That is a situation you need to remove yourself from, no matter how difficult you think it may be.
Tyrone's memory will live on through those who still suffer from his loss.
His birthday was June the 29th. And always they would have something, big cookout, and everyone gathered together, and, and, oh man, they always remember my son. Tyrone won't be forgotten. Like I tell people, God has his reasons for everything that goes on in our life.
November 14th, 1997. The air over Vancouver Island carried the kind of cold that crawled slowly under your jacket instead of striking all at once. The streets of Saanich, British Columbia, were wet from an earlier drizzle, reflecting pale orange streetlights across quiet suburban roads. Most families were inside by then. Televisions glowed behind curtains. Porch lights buzzed softly against the dark. It looked like an ordinary Friday night in a peaceful Canadian community. The kind of place where parents believed their children were safe as long as they came home before midnight. The kind of place where evil was expected to arrive from somewhere else. Not from the children raised there. Not from the kids laughing beneath a bridge. And certainly not from a circle of teenage girls. Hours later, somewhere near the Gorge Waterway beneath the Craigflower Bridge, A 14-year-old girl named Rena Verk would be beaten, humiliated, hunted through the darkness, and drowned in shallow water while other teenagers watched the night swallow her whole. What happened to Rena Vick did not begin with murder. It began with whispers. With insults muttered in school hallways. With eyes rolling when she entered a room. With laughter that stopped the moment she looked up. It began the way many horrors begin, not with blood, but with loneliness. Because before Rena became a headline, before newspaper reporters crowded outside courtrooms and television anchors struggled to explain how children could become capable of such brutality, she was simply a girl trying desperately to belong somewhere. And in the final hours of her life, that desperate need would lead her directly into the hands of the people who hated her most. Years later, investigators, psychologists, journalists, and ordinary people across Canada would continue asking the same impossible question. How did a group of teenagers reach a point where beating another child felt entertaining? How did dozens of young people stand nearby while a human being was stripped of dignity piece by piece? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how did the darkness inside a single night reveal something far uglier hiding beneath the surface of an entire community? The story of Rena Verk is not just a murder case. It is a story about cruelty becoming normal. About the terrifying power of group violence. About what happens when humiliation turns into sport. And it is a story that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes monsters do not arrive wearing masks. Sometimes they wear school backpacks. Sometimes they are 14 years old. Witnesses would later describe fragments of that night in broken, inconsistent pieces. A crowd of teenagers moving from Shoreline Middle School toward the bridge after police dispersed them. Cigarette smoke curling into the cold air. Music playing from cheap portable speakers. Girls laughing too loudly. Boys trying to impress each other. The restless energy of adolescence mixed with boredom and anger. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos stood Rena. Heavyset. Insecure. Vulnerable. Trying to smile at people who had already decided she was beneath them. She did not know that some members of the group had lured her there intentionally. She did not know that rumors about her had been circulating for days. She did not know that before the night ended, strangers would study autopsy photographs of her bruised face in courtroom silence. At first, the violence unfolded almost casually. That is what makes it so horrifying. There was no dramatic cinematic moment where the atmosphere suddenly changed. No thunder cracking overhead. No warning sign screaming for someone to run. It started with insults. Someone shoved her. Someone else slapped her. Then another joined in. Then another. The group tightened around her like a closing fist. Shoes slammed into ribs. Hands yanked her hair backward. Cigarettes burned against skin. Teenagers standing nearby laughed nervously, some pretending not to watch while continuing to watch anyway. Rena tried to protect herself, but there is almost nothing a single terrified child can do against a crowd feeding off each other's aggression. Violence behaves differently inside groups. It spreads. One person throws a punch, and suddenly everyone feels permitted to become someone else. Meaner. Louder. Crueler. Individual guilt dissolves into collective momentum. The mob becomes its own creature. And that creature wanted blood. By the time the first assault ended, Rena was battered, humiliated, and crying. Some witnesses later claimed they believed it was over. The group had vented its anger. The entertainment was finished. Rena was allowed to leave. She walked away injured and alone into the darkness beside the water. But two figures followed her. 15-year-old Kelly Ellard and 16-year-old Warren Glowatsky disappeared after Rena into the cold night near the gorge. And somewhere away from the crowd, away from the nervous laughter and shifting eyes, the violence transformed into murder. In the years that followed, Kelly Ellard would become one of the most infamous teenage killers in Canadian history. Reporters studying courtroom footage often focused on her expression because it disturbed people so deeply. She did not fit society's image of a murderer. She was young, blonde, soft-faced. At times she smiled in court. At times she appeared bored. People searched desperately for visible signs of evil and found only a teenage girl chewing gum beneath fluorescent courtroom lights. Warren Glowatsky seemed different. Quieter. More withdrawn. Over time, he would show remorse that many believed was genuine. But remorse arrives after the damage. After the water fills the lungs. After parents identify a body. After a family's life fractures permanently into before and after. Long before the trials began, before documentaries and books and television adaptations revisited every painful detail, there was simply a missing 14-year-old girl. Her family waited for her to come home. Hours passed. Then an entire night. Then another. Every parent knows the sickening feeling when a child is late returning home. The clock grows louder. Every passing car sounds like hope. Every silence becomes unbearable. But for the Vuk family, the waiting slowly transformed into something colder. Something irreversible. 8 days after Rena vanished, her body was discovered near the Gorge Waterway. The remains told a brutal story even before investigators fully understood what happened. Bruises covered her body. There were marks from shoes on her head. Gravel had entered her mouth and throat as she drowned face down in shallow water. She had not died instantly. She had suffered. The realization hit the community like a physical blow. Adults struggled to process the details because the killers were not hardened criminals. They were children. Children who attended school dances. Children with parents waiting at home. Children who, only hours before the murder, had probably argued about homework or music or weekend plans. The disconnect terrified people. Society depends heavily on the comforting belief that youth equals innocence. Rena Vuk's murder shattered that illusion. Suddenly parents across Canada looked differently at school bullying. Teasing no longer felt harmless. Social exclusion no longer seemed like a normal part of adolescence. Because hidden beneath insults and gossip, investigators uncovered something much darker: sustained dehumanization. Rena had not simply been disliked. She had been transformed into a target long before she arrived beneath that bridge. To many of the teenagers involved, she had stopped feeling fully human. And once that happens, cruelty becomes easier. Humiliation becomes funny. Violence becomes exciting. Death becomes possible. The bridge itself would become infamous after the murder. Craigflower Bridge stretched over dark water and tangled shoreline, isolated enough at night to feel disconnected from the safety of nearby neighborhoods. During daylight, it looked ordinary. Cars passed overhead. Water moved quietly beneath it. But after November 1997, the location carried a different weight. Locals could no longer cross it without remembering what happened underneath. Journalists described the area endlessly. Filmmakers recreated it. Visitors came to see it. But no photograph ever fully captures the atmosphere witnesses described from that night: the damp cold, the smell of mud and cigarettes, the nervous energy of teenagers drifting between boredom and violence. There is something uniquely unsettling about crimes involving groups of young people because they force us to confront the fragility of morality itself. Adults like to believe cruelty is rare and obvious. Yet the murder of Rena Vuk revealed how ordinary social dynamics, peer pressure, insecurity, the craving for acceptance, can slowly mutate into atrocity under the right conditions. Nobody wakes up one morning planning to participate in a murder beneath a bridge. The path there is gradual. A joke at someone's expense. A rumor. Public humiliation. The reward of fitting in. The thrill of power over someone weaker. Step by step, the line between cruelty and entertainment disappears. Rena spent much of her short life trying to escape isolation. Friends later described her as vulnerable, sensitive, and eager for approval. She often reinvented herself depending on who she was around, hoping each new version might finally earn acceptance. But adolescence can be merciless toward visible desperation. The harder she tried to fit in with certain groups, the more they sensed weakness. And predators, whether teenagers or adults, instinctively move toward weakness. What makes the story even more tragic is that many people around Rena recognized pieces of the danger beforehand. Teachers noticed bullying. Students heard threats. Family members worried about the crowd she wanted acceptance from. But modern bullying often unfolds invisibly to adults. It lives in whispers, rumors, shifting alliances, silent humiliations impossible to fully document until it escalates beyond control. By the time violence becomes visible, the emotional damage has usually existed for months or years. In courtroom testimony, witnesses would later describe bizarre moments of emotional detachment during the assault. Teenagers standing nearby smoked cigarettes while watching. Some laughed because others laughed. Some later admitted they were afraid to intervene. Others claimed they thought the violence was exaggerated playfighting. Human beings are disturbingly skilled at convincing themselves they are not responsible for what they witness. Especially inside crowds. Especially when fear of social rejection outweighs empathy. That night beneath the bridge became a collision of countless small failures. Failed compassion. Failed courage. Failed intervention. Failed belonging. And at the center of it stood a 14-year-old girl who wanted so badly to be accepted that she walked willingly toward the people who despised her. This is why the murder of Rena Vick continues haunting people decades later. Not because it feels distant and unimaginable, but because it feels recognizable. Most people remember school cruelty, the gossip, the exclusion, the moments where entire groups turned against one person. Rena's story forces us to imagine what happens when nobody stops the escalation. When humiliation is allowed to evolve unchecked. When teenagers treat another child like an object rather than a human being. The result was not merely a murder. It was a public unraveling of innocence itself. And for Canada, the nightmare was only beginning. In the late 1990s, Sanic was the kind of place people described with words like peaceful, quiet, family-oriented. Nestled on the southern edge of Vancouver Island, just outside Victoria, the district carried the soft, restrained beauty so often associated with the Canadian Pacific coast. Evergreen trees leaned over damp roads. The ocean air rolled through neighborhoods in cold morning waves. Small houses sat behind trimmed lawns and faded basketball hoops. On weekends, parents walked dogs through parks while teenagers wandered shopping centers searching for anything to interrupt the boredom of suburban adolescence. From the outside, it looked safe. But safety is often a performance communities rehearse for themselves. Beneath the postcard image of calm neighborhoods and polite smiles existed another world entirely, one adults rarely saw clearly. A hidden ecosystem of teenage hierarchies, humiliations, social warfare, and violence simmered beneath the surface of schools and playgrounds. By 1997, Shoreline Middle School had quietly become one of the places where that darkness gathered. The building itself looked ordinary enough. Long hallways lined with lockers. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. Posters about anti-drug campaigns peeling at the corners. Teachers carrying stacks of papers between classrooms. But for many students, especially those on the social margins, Shoreline could feel less like a school and more like a battlefield where survival depended on reading invisible rules. Teenagers formed tribes quickly there. Athletes. Troublemakers. Girls who controlled social circles through intimidation disguised as charisma. Boys desperate to appear dangerous. And somewhere drifting between those groups were vulnerable kids searching for identity, hoping each school day would hurt a little less than the last. Adolescence amplifies cruelty because teenagers are still discovering power. Some discover it through talent or popularity. Others discover it through fear. At Shoreline, intimidation had become a form of currency. Rumors spread through hallways like wildfire. Weakness was hunted instinctively. If someone cried publicly, the humiliation could follow them for months. A single embarrassing story might evolve into an entire identity overnight. And in that environment, difference became dangerous. Rena Vick was different in ways impossible to hide. She was larger than many girls her age. She came from a strict religious household. She was one of the few South Asian students in her social environment. She struggled socially and emotionally. Most painfully of all, she wanted acceptance too openly. Predatory personalities noticed desperation immediately. To certain teenagers at Shoreline, Rena became easy entertainment. But before she became a victim in the eyes of the world, she was simply a child growing up inside a deeply conflicted home. Reena was born in 1983 to parents Manjit and Suman Vick, immigrants of Indian descent who had settled in British Columbia. Her family practiced Jehovah's Witness beliefs, a faith that shaped much of her upbringing. Inside the Vick household, rules were strict, especially regarding behavior, friendships, dating, and appearance. Reena lived in a world divided between obedience at home and painful rejection outside it. At home, there were expectations about modesty, discipline, and religious devotion. Outside, there were teenagers smoking behind schools, skipping class, experimenting with rebellion, and building social status through defiance. Reena stood between those worlds awkwardly, belonging fully to neither. Family photographs from her childhood show a girl with soft cheeks and a shy smile. There are moments where she appears genuinely happy, standing beside relatives during celebrations, smiling carefully toward the camera as children often do when still untouched by public humiliation. But people who knew Reena later described a girl carrying profound insecurity beneath the surface. She often felt unattractive, unwanted, invisible. The older she grew, the more desperate she became to reinvent herself into someone others might finally admire. That desperation would shape almost every major decision in her life. During her early teenage years, Reena began rebelling against her family's strict environment. Arguments inside the household became increasingly intense. She wanted freedom. Her parents wanted control. The tension created emotional fractures that widened over time. Like many teenagers struggling with identity, Reena searched for belonging outside her home. Unfortunately, the people she admired most were often the very people most likely to hurt her. She became fascinated with tougher girls at school. Girls who smoked cigarettes confidently, cursed openly, wore dark makeup, and carried themselves with an aggression Reena mistook for strength. To her, they looked fearless, untouchable, accepted. She wanted desperately to stand beside them instead of being laughed at by them. So she changed pieces of herself repeatedly. She experimented with clothing, language, behavior. She told stories to make herself seem more experienced or rebellious. Some classmates later claimed she exaggerated details about her life to gain attention. But beneath those attempts was a painfully recognizable teenage longing, the desire to become someone worthy of inclusion. Unfortunately, insecurity often attracts predators rather than friends. By the mid-1990s, youth culture in parts of British Columbia carried influences from grunge music, gang imagery, rebellion culture, and rising youth violence. Teenagers adopted tough personas partially because fearlessness carried social value. Some girls in particular developed reputations for aggression that intimidated peers and earned admiration inside certain circles. Violence became performative. Public humiliation became entertainment. And because most confrontations occurred among juveniles, adults frequently underestimated the seriousness of what was happening. Teachers saw drama. Students experienced psychological warfare. At Shoreline, several girls had already built reputations as volatile and dangerous before Reena's murder. Fights happened regularly enough that students became desensitized. Insults escalated quickly into physical attacks. Loyalty within friend groups shifted constantly. Social survival depended on understanding who could be mocked safely and who must never be challenged. Reena consistently occupied the vulnerable end of that hierarchy. She was bullied for her appearance, bullied for her ethnicity, bullied for trying too hard. Some students viewed her as strange. Others saw her as annoying. Few recognized how deeply isolated she truly felt. Adolescence can create a terrifying paradox. The lonelier someone becomes, the more willing they are to tolerate abuse for moments of temporary acceptance. Reena repeatedly returned to people who mistreated her because exclusion felt worse than humiliation. In the months before her death, her life grew increasingly unstable. She ran away from home several times after conflicts with her parents. At one point, she accused her father of abuse, leading to intervention from social services and police. The allegations created enormous strain inside the family. Some investigators later believed Reena partly fabricated or exaggerated claims because she desperately wanted escape and attention. Others argued her home environment was emotionally suffocating enough to drive her toward rebellion regardless. The truth likely existed somewhere in the complicated gray area many troubled families inhabit. What mattered most was this: Rena no longer felt safe emotionally either at home or at school. That combination can leave teenagers dangerously vulnerable. She began spending more time around troubled peers, drifting closer toward kids involved in petty crime, fights, and drug experimentation. Yet even among those circles, acceptance remained conditional. Rena was tolerated when useful, mocked when convenient. There were moments where people invited her to gatherings only to laugh at her afterward. Some classmates recalled seeing her desperately trying to imitate personalities she admired, speaking tougher than she naturally was, pretending confidence she did not possess. But teenagers are experts at detecting insecurity. The harder Rena tried, the more exposed she became. Around this same period, tensions escalated between Rena and several girls connected to Shoreline social circles. Rumors spread rapidly. Stories changed depending on who told them. Some accounts involved accusations that Rena had been spreading gossip. Others claimed personal betrayals or stolen belongings fueled resentment. In teenage social ecosystems, factual truth often matters less than emotional momentum. Once someone becomes designated as a target, hostility feeds itself. Every interaction reinforces the group narrative that the victim deserves ridicule. By the fall of 1997, Rena's social standing had deteriorated badly. She was frequently insulted publicly. Some students threatened her openly. Yet she continued trying to insert herself into the same social groups. Looking back, it is easy to ask why she kept returning. But loneliness distorts judgment. Human beings will endure astonishing cruelty for the possibility of connection. Meanwhile, the broader culture surrounding youth violence in Canada was changing. Media coverage increasingly focused on teenage aggression, gang influences, and school safety. Yet much of the public imagination still associated serious violence primarily with boys. Female aggression was often dismissed as harmless drama compared to male brutality. Rena Vuk's murder would shatter that assumption permanently. But before the tragedy, many warning signs failed to trigger intervention because adults underestimated the capacity for violence among teenage girls. There were stories already circulating around Shoreline about girls orchestrating fights for entertainment. About crowds gathering to watch beatings after school. About social status increasing through intimidation. Yet these incidents rarely produced meaningful consequences. Students learned quickly that cruelty often carried rewards rather than punishment. Attention, fear, popularity, control. The environment around Craigflower Bridge also played an important role in teenage social life. The area beneath the bridge had become a gathering place for youths seeking privacy away from parents and authorities. Teenagers drank alcohol there, smoked cigarettes, experimented with drugs, and socialized late into the night. The gorge waterway itself moved quietly through the darkness beside them, black and cold beneath the bridge supports. During daytime, the area looked calm, almost beautiful. But at night it transformed. Shadows swallowed faces. Voices echoed strangely beneath concrete. The isolation created a feeling of separation from normal rules. Teenagers often behave differently in spaces where they believe adults cannot see them. That psychological shift matters. Under the bridge, identities changed. Vulnerable kids became targets. Aggressive personalities became performers. And crowds became unpredictable. November arrived with the damp chill typical of coastal British Columbia. Rainfall darkened roads early in the evening. School routines continued as normal on the surface. Students attended classes, joked with friends, flirted in hallways, worried about trivial teenage concerns. Yet beneath ordinary routines, tensions involving Rena quietly intensified. Some girls were openly angry with her. Others viewed her as pathetic enough to mock casually without consequence. Few could have imagined the violence approaching. Or perhaps more accurately, few wanted to imagine it. Because acknowledging the danger would have required confronting how normalized cruelty had already become. On the day of November 14, 1997, teenagers across Sanik prepared for another Friday night. Some planned parties. Others arranged rides around town. Parents assumed their children were participating in ordinary adolescent freedom. Somewhere among those teenagers was Rena Vec, still yearning for acceptance despite everything. She was only 14 years old. 14, a fragile age balanced painfully between childhood and adulthood. Old enough to crave independence, yet still emotionally unequipped to recognize certain dangers. She likely spent part of that day thinking about ordinary things. What people thought about her. Whether someone might finally include her. Whether she could reshape herself into a version worthy of friendship. It is haunting to imagine how close she stood to the end of her life while still carrying such ordinary teenage hopes. As evening approached, plans formed for a gathering near Shoreline School. Teenagers spread the word casually. Some expected nothing more than drinking, smoking, and wandering around town. Others carried unresolved anger with them into the night. And somewhere beneath all the noise and adolescent chaos, an invisible line waited to be crossed. Once crossed, an entire country would spend decades trying to understand how children became capable of something so merciless beneath a bridge in the cold Canadian dark. Before the headlines reduced her to the victim, before courtroom sketches and television reenactments transformed her death into a national symbol, Rena Vec was a girl standing awkwardly in front of her bedroom mirror. Trying to decide who she needed to become in order for people to finally like her. She was 14 years old, caught in the painful space between childhood innocence and teenage reinvention, where identity feels less like something discovered and more like something desperately assembled from scraps of approval. In many ways, Rena spent most of her life trying to become visible to people who only saw her as a target. Her story did not begin beneath a bridge. It began years earlier, inside a family home where love existed alongside control, expectation, and emotional distance. The Vec household sat in a quiet neighborhood in British Columbia, outwardly similar to countless immigrant family homes across North America. Shoes lined near the doorway. Religious literature stacked carefully on tables. The smell of traditional Indian cooking lingering in the kitchen during evenings. Family photographs decorating walls with frozen moments of celebration and hope. To outsiders, the Vecs appeared disciplined and respectable, deeply committed to their faith and their children's future. But inside the house, tension moved quietly through everyday life. Rena's parents had immigrated to Canada carrying the weight many immigrant families know intimately, the pressure to preserve identity while surviving inside a culture that constantly threatens to erase it. They wanted structure for their daughter. Morality. Discipline. Protection from influences they considered dangerous. But Rena was growing up in a completely different world than the one her parents understood. At school, popularity depended on rebellion, appearance, attitude, confidence. The teenagers she admired were not obedient or reserved. They were loud. Defiant. Fearless. Every day she walked between two incompatible realities, and neither one fully accepted her. Rena's childhood carried signs of emotional vulnerability early on. Family members later described her as sensitive and eager for affection. She wanted approval deeply, perhaps more deeply than those around her realized. Children like Rena often become emotional mirrors, shaping themselves according to whoever stands in front of them. If someone praised toughness, she tried to appear tough. If someone valued rebellion, she experimented with rebellion. Beneath every version of herself was the same aching question: will you accept me now? But adolescence is brutal toward uncertainty. At school, Rena struggled socially almost immediately. Her appearance alone made her stand out. She was heavier than many girls her age, physically awkward, and visibly insecure. In teenage environments where conformity acts like social armor, difference can feel like a wound exposed in public. Some classmates mocked her openly. Others ignored her completely. Neither response is harmless to a developing mind. Loneliness during adolescence does not feel temporary. It feels eternal. Hallways became emotionally dangerous places for Rena. She learned to scan faces quickly, searching for signs of ridicule before conversations even began. Teenagers can weaponize silence with terrifying precision. Sometimes nobody needed to insult her directly. A glance exchanged between classmates could say enough. A suppressed laugh. A whispered comment just loud enough to hear. An invitation deliberately withheld. Over time, humiliation accumulated inside her quietly, layering itself into shame. Yet despite the rejection, Rena continued trying. That is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of her story. She did not retreat entirely inward. She kept reaching toward people. Kept reinventing herself. Kept believing acceptance might still be possible if she could just transform enough pieces of who she was. Friends and classmates later described how dramatically her personality shifted depending on the social group around her. Around certain kids, she acted rebellious and confrontational. Around others, she became softer, eager to please. She experimented with makeup, clothing, slang, and attitudes she thought might help her fit into tougher social circles. Sometimes she lied or exaggerated stories to make herself seem more exciting. But most insecure teenagers do this in some form. They build identities from aspiration rather than certainty. The tragedy is that Rena's attempts often had the opposite effect. Instead of making her accepted, they made her appear desperate to the very people whose approval she sought. Desperation is dangerous in adolescent social hierarchies. Predatory personalities sense it immediately. Around this time, conflict inside the Vick household intensified. Rena's parents struggled to understand the emotional world their daughter was entering. They viewed many of her behaviors as rebellion requiring stricter discipline. Rena viewed their control as suffocating. Arguments escalated frequently. She wanted freedom to spend time with peers, experiment socially, and escape the rigid expectations surrounding her. Her parents worried she was drifting toward harmful influences. Both sides felt misunderstood. Neither knew how catastrophic the consequences would eventually become. One of the deepest fractures emerged around Rena's growing desire for independence. She wanted to stay out later, dress differently, spend time with people her parents distrusted. In many immigrant households, generational conflict carries additional emotional complexity because parents often fear losing not only authority, but cultural identity itself. Rena's rebellion therefore felt larger than ordinary teenage disobedience. To her parents, it threatened the values anchoring the family together. To Rena, their restrictions confirmed the painful feeling that nobody truly understood her. At one point, after severe family conflict, Rena ran away from home. The incident triggered police involvement and social service intervention. She made allegations against her father that fractured trust within the family and intensified public attention around her life. Whether every detail was accurate became heavily debated later, but emotionally, the message was unmistakable. Rena no longer believed home was a safe emotional refuge. She felt trapped there just as she felt unwanted at school. Imagine the psychological exhaustion of existing between those worlds at 14 years old. No stable place to feel fully accepted. No social environment where she could relax into herself naturally. Just constant adaptation, constant performance, constant fear of rejection. Human beings cannot live indefinitely without belonging somewhere. Eventually they become willing to tolerate dangerous people rather than face isolation alone. Rena began spending more time around troubled teenagers partly because they represented escape from invisibility. Even negative attention felt preferable to being ignored. Some members of these social circles smoked, drank alcohol, skipped school, and cultivated intimidating reputations. Rena admired them because they seemed powerful in ways she never felt herself. She mistook aggression for confidence. Cruelty for strength. This is common among emotionally vulnerable teenagers searching for identity. They gravitate toward dominant personalities believing proximity to power might protect them from humiliation. Instead, it often exposes them to exploitation. Certain girls within these circles developed especially toxic relationships with Rena. Publicly, they mocked her appearance, her behavior, her attempts to fit in. Privately, they sometimes tolerated her presence when bored or needing someone lower in the social hierarchy to dominate. The emotional dynamic resembled bullying disguised as friendship. Rena accepted treatment that healthier, more secure teenagers would have rejected immediately because exclusion terrified her more than disrespect. There were moments where she believed she was finally being accepted, only to realize later she had become the joke itself. Some classmates recalled seeing Rena follow groups of girls through school grounds, laughing too loudly at their jokes, trying desperately to maintain inclusion. Others remembered how quickly social situations turned cruel once she left the room. The girls she admired often ridiculed her mercilessly behind her back. Yet somehow she kept returning, kept hoping, kept believing she could eventually earn genuine friendship if she endured enough humiliation first. Adolescence distorts emotional logic this way. The teenage brain prioritizes belonging with extraordinary intensity because social exclusion once carried evolutionary consequences for survival. To a 14-year-old, rejection does not merely hurt feelings. It threatens identity itself. Rena's ethnicity also shaped her experiences in ways impossible to separate from the bullying she endured. Growing up as one of the few South Asian girls within predominantly white social environments created additional isolation. Some insults directed toward her carried racist undertones. She was made to feel foreign even within her own community. Over time, she became increasingly self-conscious about her appearance, her background, and the ways she differed from the girls she admired. Cultural identity, adolescence, and insecurity collided painfully inside her developing sense of self. There were still moments of hope scattered throughout her life. Family members remembered her humor, her occasional warmth, her desire to connect emotionally with others despite repeated rejection. She loved music. She cared deeply about friendships, even unstable ones. Like many teenagers, she imagined future versions of herself that felt happier and more accepted. It is important to remember this because victims of infamous crimes often become frozen permanently at the moment of death in public memory. But Rena existed fully before the tragedy. She had dreams, embarrassing moments, private fears, ordinary routines. She was not merely a symbol. She was a child still forming. By 1997, however, emotional damage had accumulated heavily. Rena's self-esteem depended almost entirely on external validation. She became increasingly willing to endure mistreatment for fleeting moments of inclusion. At school, rumors circulated around her constantly. Some involved boys. Others involved conflicts with girls. Stories evolved through gossip until truth barely mattered anymore. What mattered was social momentum. Once enough people decided someone deserved ridicule, cruelty became communal entertainment. Several teenagers later admitted that bullying Rena simply became normalized over time. That normalization is one of the most frightening aspects of her story. No single insult or humiliation appears catastrophic in isolation. But repetition changes perception. The target gradually stops feeling fully human to the group. Empathy erodes slowly, almost invisibly. People begin speaking about the victim as an object, a joke, a problem, rather than a person experiencing pain internally. Rena likely sensed this transformation happening around her, yet she lacked the emotional tools to escape it. Instead, she pushed harder toward acceptance. In the weeks leading up to her death, tensions between Rena and certain girls escalated significantly. There were arguments, accusations, and growing hostility. Some girls believed she had spread rumors. Others simply enjoyed targeting her because group dynamics rewarded aggression. Witnesses later described hearing threats made openly against Rena before the murder. Yet within adolescent culture, dramatic threats often blend into everyday noise. Adults underestimate them. Teenagers dismiss them. Nobody imagines how quickly social violence can become physical. Looking back now, the warning signs appear everywhere. A vulnerable girl isolated from stable support systems. Increasingly aggressive peer groups. Public humiliations escalating unchecked. Emotional desperation colliding with predatory social dynamics. But tragedies often look obvious only in retrospect. At the time, most people saw fragments rather than the full picture. Teachers saw difficult students. Parents saw teenage rebellion. Students saw gossip and fights. Few recognized a 14-year-old girl slowly moving toward catastrophe because her need to belong had overridden her instinct for self-protection. On November 14, 1997, Rena prepared to meet people she believed might finally include her. Somewhere inside her existed the ordinary teenage hope that the night could change things socially. Maybe tensions would fade. Maybe she would finally feel accepted instead of mocked. Maybe she would stop being the outsider standing awkwardly at the edge of every group. It is devastating to imagine how vulnerable she must have felt walking toward that gathering near Shoreline. The cold night air. The nervous anticipation. The desire to be wanted. She could not know that some of the people waiting there already viewed her as less than human. She could not know that by the following week, newspapers across Canada would publish her name beside words like savage, brutal, and shocking. She was still just Rena then. A lonely 14-year-old girl searching for belonging in the worst possible place. By the evening of November 14, 1997, the cold had settled heavily across Saanich. Moisture hung in the air from earlier rain, leaving the pavement slick beneath streetlights and coating the metal railings near Craigflower Bridge with a thin sheen of water. Cars moved through the suburban roads in quiet streams while families inside nearby homes settled into ordinary Friday night routines. Televisions flickered behind curtains. Parents believed their children were out with friends, wandering harmlessly through the familiar rhythms of teenage life. Nobody looking at the quiet neighborhood surrounding Shoreline School could have imagined that before sunrise, a 14-year-old girl would be dead beneath the bridge nearby. The gathering that night began the way many teenage gatherings do, disorganized, restless, fueled by boredom and social tension. Groups of teenagers drifted toward Shoreline Middle School after dark, carrying cigarettes, cheap alcohol, and the loud, unstable energy that often emerges when adolescents gather without supervision. Some came hoping for excitement. Some came to flirt. Some simply did not want to spend another Friday night alone at home. Among them was Rena Vick. She arrived carrying the same fragile hope she carried into so many social situations, the hope that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe she would finally feel accepted instead of tolerated. Maybe the girls who mocked her would soften. Maybe she could step briefly inside the world she admired from the outside. But tension was already waiting for her before she arrived. In the days leading up to that night, rumors and anger involving Rena had spread through local teenage circles. Different people later offered different explanations. Some claimed certain girls believed Rena had been spreading gossip. Others insisted old resentments and personal insults had accumulated over time. The precise trigger mattered less than the emotional atmosphere surrounding her. Rena had become a target long before she reached the bridge. And in group environments, once a target has been chosen, violence can begin feeling inevitable. Witnesses later described the atmosphere near Shoreline that night as chaotic and emotionally charged. Teenagers clustered in circles beneath dim lighting, smoking cigarettes and laughing loudly into the cold air. Music drifted from portable stereos. Some kids wandered between groups searching for social footing while others performed toughness for attention. Underneath the casual teenage behavior moved something darker, the constant social calculation of who belonged and who did not. Rena entered that environment already vulnerable. Some witnesses later recalled tension almost immediately after she arrived. Hostile comments. Sharp looks. The subtle social signals that communicate danger before violence ever begins. At some point during the evening, police arrived near the school after reports of teenagers gathering there. Officers dispersed the crowd, pushing groups away from school property. But instead of ending the night, the movement only relocated it. Teenagers drifted from the school grounds toward the area beneath Craigflower Bridge near the Gorge Waterway. The location had long been known as a gathering place for local youth isolated enough to avoid adults, hidden enough to create the illusion that normal rules no longer applied there. The bridge loomed overhead against the dark sky while black water moved slowly below. Mud-lined sections of the shoreline. Trees and brush swallowed portions of the path into shadow. The deeper the teenagers moved beneath the bridge, the further they felt from consequences. At first, the atmosphere remained almost playful. Clusters of teenagers talked and smoked while moving through the darkness. But around Rena, the emotional temperature was changing rapidly. Witnesses later described girls confronting her verbally. The insults escalated quickly. Rena tried to respond, but confidence had never come naturally to her. She often overcompensated socially when nervous, which sometimes intensified hostility instead of diffusing it. One insult turned into shoving. Shoving turned into open aggression. Then the group closed around her. Violence inside crowds rarely begins as organized murder. It grows through momentum. One person acts cruelly, then another follows, emboldened by the lack of resistance. Individual morality weakens beneath collective energy. That process unfolded around Rena with horrifying speed. A girl struck her. Someone else grabbed her hair. Another shoved her backward. Within moments, multiple teenagers were participating. Witnesses later described Rena being punched, slapped, kicked, and dragged. Her attackers pulled at her clothing and hair while surrounding teenagers watched. Some laughed nervously. Some stared silently. Others joined in briefly before stepping back again. Cigarettes were pressed against her skin. Shoes slammed into her body. The crowd shifted with the unstable rhythm of mob violence, bursts of chaos followed by moments of stunned stillness before another attack erupted. Rena tried to defend herself, but she was overwhelmed physically and emotionally. There is something especially horrifying about group assaults because the victim loses not only safety but humanity itself. A single attacker still acknowledges another person as an opponent. A crowd transforms the victim into an object. Entertainment. A social ritual. Rena was no longer being treated like a frightened 14-year-old girl. She had become the center of a performance fueled by humiliation and dominance. Witnesses later described her crying and pleading during portions of the assault. Yet the violence continued. Some teenagers looked away but remained nearby. Others later claimed they felt too afraid to intervene because certain girls involved had reputations for aggression. Fear spread through the crowd just as cruelty did. Nobody wanted to become the next target. At some point, the first major assault ended. Rena was battered, humiliated, and emotionally shattered. Her body already carried bruises and burns. Dirt clung to her clothes. Her breathing was ragged from panic and pain. But incredibly, she was still alive. Some witnesses later claimed they believed the situation was over. The group had released its anger. Rena had been punished socially. The violence had reached its limit. In normal human thinking, there should have been a limit. But what happened next would permanently separate this case from ordinary teenage brutality. Rena began walking away from the group through the darkness near the gorge waterway. Injured and alone, she moved away from the bridge, likely focused only on escaping the humiliation behind her. It is impossible to know exactly what she was thinking in those moments. Perhaps relief that the assault had ended. Perhaps shock. Perhaps disbelief at how quickly the night had collapsed into violence. Blood may already have been in her mouth from the beating. Her body hurt. Her emotions were likely numb beneath adrenaline. She was only 14 years old, trying to leave a nightmare behind her. But two figures separated from the crowd and followed her into the darkness. Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky walked after Rena away from the others. Later testimony would reveal that while many teenagers remained near the bridge, these two pursued her with continued aggression. This second phase of the attack unfolded away from most witnesses, making reconstruction dependent on confessions, testimony, and forensic evidence. What investigators eventually pieced together remains deeply disturbing. Rena was attacked again near the water. The violence became more personal, more focused, stripped of the chaotic group energy that defined the earlier beating. According to testimony, Kelly and Warren assaulted Rena physically, knocking her to the ground repeatedly. At some point, her head was slammed against a tree. The force left devastating injuries. The dark shoreline became the setting for a final escalation beyond humiliation and into murder. The gorge waterway beside them reflected almost no light that night. The water was shallow near the edge but brutally cold. Mud and rocks lined portions of the bank. During the attack, Rena either attempted to escape again or became too injured to resist effectively. Her attackers dragged or forced her toward the water's edge. Then they drowned her. The details remain horrifying precisely because of their intimacy. This was not an accidental death caused by reckless violence spiraling out of control. Rena was held underwater while conscious, while terrified, while fighting to breathe. Autopsy evidence later showed gravel in her airways, confirming she inhaled water and debris face down near the shoreline. She died there beneath the bridge while nearby neighborhoods slept peacefully. And perhaps the most chilling part of the entire crime is how ordinary the night continued to appear elsewhere. Cars still crossed the bridge overhead. Families still watched television nearby. Teenagers still laughed in distant groups, unaware that murder had just occurred among people they knew. Violence of this scale feels impossible partly because life around it continues normally. The world does not pause when innocence disappears. After the murder, Kelly and Warren returned from the shoreline. Witnesses later described them rejoining others after following Rena away. The exact emotional atmosphere among the teenagers afterward remains difficult to reconstruct because fear, denial, and confusion quickly distorted memories. Some may not have realized immediately that Rena was dead. Others suspected something terrible had happened but avoided confronting it directly. Human beings often retreat psychologically from truths too disturbing to process. Especially children. Eventually the crowd dispersed into the cold early morning hours. Teenagers returned home carrying fragments of what they had seen. Some washed mud from their shoes. Some smoked cigarettes while replaying the violence silently in their minds. Some convinced themselves it had not gone as far as they feared. Meanwhile, beneath the darkness near the gorge waterway, Rena's body remained alone in the shallow water. The bridge above her stood silent against the November sky. Hours passed. Then daylight arrived over Sanic as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Parents made breakfast. Commuters crossed the bridge. Students prepared for another school day. Yet somewhere beneath that ordinary morning, a murdered 14-year-old girl lay hidden near the shoreline. Rena's family had no idea yet that she would never come home again. They only knew she was missing. At first, perhaps they hoped she had run away again after another argument or emotional conflict. But as time passed without contact, fear began replacing hope. Every hour deepened uncertainty. And while the Vuk family searched desperately for answers, rumors already spread quietly among teenagers connected to the events beneath the bridge. Some students whispered about the beating. Others heard fragments about Rena disappearing afterward. Fear moved through social circles unevenly. Certain teenagers became nervous. Others denied involvement completely. But no amount of denial could erase what happened near the water that night. Because by the early hours of November 15, 1997, Rena Vuk was gone. Not vanished mysteriously into the wilderness. Not lost accidentally. Hunted, beaten, and drowned by other teenagers while a community slept nearby believing childhood still meant innocence. The first hours after a disappearance are often filled with denial. Families cling to ordinary explanations because the alternative is too terrifying to accept immediately. A teenager stayed with friends. A phone battery died. Someone needed space after an argument. The human mind protects itself this way, delaying panic until reality forces its way through the cracks. For the Vuk family, the morning after November 14th began with confusion rather than certainty. Rena had run away before. She had disappeared temporarily during emotional conflicts at home. There were patterns of rebellion, tension, and instability that made her absence frightening but not immediately unimaginable. Yet as the hours stretched into an entire day without contact, fear slowly entered the house like cold air through an open door. Every unanswered phone call deepened the silence. Every passing hour sharpened dread. Somewhere beneath that growing panic existed a possibility too horrible for her parents to fully articulate aloud. What they did not know was that while they searched desperately for their daughter, the place where she had died remained exposed to the ordinary rhythms of life. Craigflower Bridge stood over the gorge waterway exactly as it had before the murder. Cars continued crossing overhead. Rain dampened the shoreline. The dark water shifted quietly against rocks and mud near the edge where Rena's body lay hidden. The area beneath the bridge was not some isolated wilderness untouched by people. It existed beside neighborhoods, roads, and schools. That closeness made the crime feel even more unsettling later. Evil had unfolded not in some distant forgotten place, but directly beside ordinary life. As investigators initially worked the missing person case, information began emerging from students connected to Shoreline School. Teenagers talk after violence, even when fear tells them not to. Rumors moved through classrooms and hallways in fragments. There had been a fight beneath the bridge. Rena had been beaten badly. Certain girls were involved. Some students claimed she had walked away afterward. Others whispered darker possibilities without fully understanding them. Adolescents often communicate trauma indirectly, passing around pieces of horror disguised as gossip because confronting the full truth feels unbearable. Police soon learned that Rena had attended a gathering near Shoreline the night she vanished. Officers began interviewing teenagers connected to the event, but the early stages of the investigation were chaotic. Witnesses contradicted one another constantly. Some minimized the violence. Others omitted names out of fear or loyalty. Certain teenagers clearly knew more than they admitted. Detectives faced one of the most difficult aspects of investigating crimes involving groups of juveniles, separating truth from performance, fear, and shifting alliances. Teenagers are highly sensitive to social consequences. Even after witnessing brutality, many still prioritize group loyalty over honesty, especially when the people involved carry reputations for aggression. While investigators worked through conflicting accounts, the physical search for Rena intensified. Search teams examined areas near the Gorge Waterway. Family members waited through unbearable uncertainty. Hope and terror existed simultaneously now. Missing person cases create a unique psychological torment because families remain suspended between possibilities. As long as no body is found, the mind continues searching for survival scenarios. Perhaps she is hiding somewhere. Perhaps she is injured. Perhaps she is afraid to come home. Every possibility hurts, but death still remains abstract until evidence destroys denial completely. 8 days after Rena disappeared, that evidence emerged from the water. On November 22, 1997, her body was discovered near the Gorge Waterway not far from Craigflower Bridge. The discovery transformed the case instantly from a missing person investigation into one of the most shocking murders in Canadian history. Officers arriving at the scene encountered a devastating image: the body of a 14-year-old girl lying near shallow water, exposed to the cold November environment for over a week. Even experienced investigators reportedly found the scene deeply disturbing. Death involving children always affects crime scenes differently. The emotional weight changes the atmosphere immediately. But Rena's condition suggested something beyond impulsive violence. It suggested sustained brutality. The shoreline itself became part of the horror. Mud clung to the area around the body. Wet rocks lined the water's edge. The bridge loomed overhead while grey skies pressed low across the landscape. Detectives began documenting every detail carefully because the environment now represented the final moments of a child's life. The position of the body, the surrounding debris, disturbances near the shoreline. Every physical detail mattered. Yet even before the autopsy, visible injuries already indicated extreme violence. Rena's body carried severe bruising across multiple areas. Her face showed signs of repeated assault. There were marks consistent with kicks and blunt force trauma. Forensic investigators understood immediately that this had not been a simple fight gone tragically wrong. The level of injury reflected rage, group violence, and prolonged attack. News of the discovery spread rapidly through the community. Parents across Saanich began hearing fragmented reports that a teenage girl had been found murdered near the bridge. Fear moved quickly because the details felt impossible to reconcile with the image of suburban safety people trusted. Murders involving teenage girls were horrifying enough. But rumors that other teenagers committed the crime generated something closer to collective disbelief. Schools changed emotionally almost overnight. Hallways filled with whispers. Students glanced nervously at one another. Teachers sensed panic beneath the surface. Some teenagers connected to the events beneath the bridge realized investigators were closing in. Others struggled privately with trauma and guilt after witnessing portions of the violence. The autopsy revealed the full scale of what Rena endured. The findings were brutal. Her body showed extensive injuries from beating and kicking. There were burns consistent with cigarettes pressed against skin. Most chilling of all, forensic examination found gravel and debris inside her airways and throat, confirming she had drowned while face down in shallow water. She had been alive when submerged. Alive while inhaling mud and water. Alive while struggling to breathe beneath the surface. The realization devastated investigators and horrified the public once details emerged. Drowning is an intensely personal form of killing. It requires proximity, control, sustained violence. Rena had not simply died during a chaotic assault. She had been held underwater until life left her body. Additional evidence deepened the horror further. Shoe impressions on her head suggested repeated kicking. Blunt force trauma indicated her head had likely been slammed against a hard surface during the attack. The injuries reflected not just violence, but dehumanization. Whoever killed Rena stopped seeing her as a frightened child long before the murder ended. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, witness accounts slowly converged around the events beneath Craigflower Bridge. Detectives learned about the first assault involving multiple teenagers. They identified the social dynamics surrounding the gathering. More importantly, they discovered that after the initial group attack, Rena had attempted to leave alive. That detail transformed the emotional landscape of the case. For a brief moment after the first beating, survival remained possible. She had walked away injured but alive into the darkness. Then someone chose to continue. Detectives began focusing heavily on two names emerging repeatedly from witness interviews, Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. Other teenagers described seeing the pair follow Rena after the initial assault. Some accounts suggested continued aggression near the water. But gathering reliable testimony from frightened adolescents proved extremely difficult. Many witnesses feared retaliation. Others minimized what they saw to protect themselves emotionally. Some simply could not process the enormity of what had happened. In group violence cases, memory often fragments under trauma and fear. Investigators had to piece together truth from overlapping inconsistencies. Meanwhile, media coverage intensified dramatically. Reporters flooded the area surrounding the bridge. News broadcasts described the murder as savage, shocking, and almost unimaginable. Public fascination grew because the case violated deeply rooted assumptions about youth violence. Female teenagers were not supposed to commit acts this brutal. Middle school social conflict was not supposed to end in drowning and homicide investigations. Yet every new detail shattered another comforting illusion. The media soon began using the phrase Shoreline 6 to describe several girls involved in the original assault. The label carried enormous symbolic power. It transformed a chaotic mob attack into something almost mythic in public consciousness, a pack of teenage girls surrounding a vulnerable victim beneath a bridge. The reality remained more complicated, but the image lodged itself deeply into the Canadian imagination. Crowds of teenagers. Cigarette burns. Kicking. Drowning. The story felt less like suburban violence and more like a nightmare emerging from society's blind spots. For Rena's family, however, the media spectacle existed alongside unbearable personal grief. They were not processing a headline. They were confronting the destruction of their daughter. Their complicated relationship with Rena before her death only intensified the emotional devastation afterward. Like many families fractured by adolescent conflict, they now faced painful guilt alongside grief. Arguments that once seemed temporary had become permanent. Every memory shifted under the knowledge that there would be no reconciliation, no future healing, no adulthood waiting ahead for their daughter. Families often replay final conversations endlessly after violent loss. What was said? What was left unsaid? Whether some small action might have changed the outcome. The Vuk family now carried those questions forever. As detectives continued interviewing teenagers, a disturbing pattern emerged regarding the crowd present during the assault. Numerous witnesses had observed portions of the violence. Some even participated briefly, yet almost nobody intervened meaningfully. Psychologists and criminologists later examined this aspect of the case intensely because it revealed something deeply unsettling about group behavior. The larger the crowd became, the more individual responsibility dissolved. Teenagers who likely would never attack someone alone found themselves swept into collective cruelty. Others remained passive despite recognizing the danger because fear of social rejection outweighed moral instinct. The bridge itself became symbolic after the body's discovery. Residents driving across Craigflower Bridge could no longer view it as ordinary infrastructure. It had become a crime scene stained psychologically by what happened beneath it. Flowers and memorials began appearing near the area. Strangers visited the site trying to comprehend how such violence unfolded there unnoticed. The location carried an eerie contradiction. Peaceful natural surroundings transformed into the setting for unimaginable brutality. Investigators working the case understood they were no longer handling a routine homicide. Public pressure mounted rapidly. Every parent wanted answers. Every journalist wanted details. And beneath the media frenzy remained the central horrifying truth. A 14-year-old girl had been bullied, beaten, hunted, and drowned by peers in a community that believed itself safe. The deeper detectives looked, the more they realized this murder had not emerged suddenly from nowhere. It had grown slowly from normalized cruelty, social hierarchy, emotional neglect, and adolescent violence left unchecked too long. Rena's death exposed wounds already existing beneath the surface of the community. Bullying that adults minimized. Teenage aggression dismissed as drama. Vulnerable children drifting between unstable homes and dangerous peer groups. The body found beside the gorge waterway forced everyone to confront those realities at once. And as investigators closed in on the teenagers responsible, another terrifying realization emerged. The killers had not fled across borders or disappeared into criminal underworlds. They had gone home afterward. Back to bedrooms decorated with posters and schoolbooks. Back to parents who may have had no idea what their children had done beneath the bridge that night. Once investigators confirmed that Rena Vick had been murdered, the atmosphere inside Sanic changed completely. Fear spread quickly through schools, neighborhoods, and households because the crime shattered something people desperately wanted to believe about children. Parents no longer viewed teenage conflict as harmless drama. Teachers suddenly replayed months of hallway confrontations in their minds. Students who had once laughed at gossip now found themselves sitting in classrooms beside potential witnesses, accomplices, or killers. The ordinary routines of adolescence continued outwardly, but beneath the surface, paranoia and suspicion infected nearly every social interaction connected to Shoreline School. Detectives assigned to the case faced enormous pressure almost immediately. Media coverage intensified daily. Reporters crowded near police stations and courthouses searching for updates. Headlines described the murder as savage and incomprehensible. Public outrage grew especially intense around one disturbing detail. Multiple teenagers had witnessed portions of the violence, yet almost nobody intervened. Investigators understood they were not simply solving a homicide anymore. They were untangling an entire ecosystem of fear, loyalty, and adolescent cruelty. The first challenge emerged from the witnesses themselves. Teenagers are notoriously unreliable under normal circumstances. In a case involving murder, group violence, and social intimidation, their testimonies became even more unstable. Some students minimized what they saw out of fear. Others altered details to protect friends. Certain teenagers exaggerated their distance from the violence once they realized the investigation had become national news. Detectives often encountered interviews where fear hung visibly in the room. Kids avoided eye contact. Voices trembled. Stories changed midway through questioning. Many were terrified not only of legal consequences but of social retaliation. Several of the teenagers involved carried reputations for aggression long before Rena's death. That fear mattered. In adolescent social hierarchies, reputation can become a form of psychological control stronger than authority itself. Investigators slowly began reconstructing the events beneath Craigflower Bridge through overlapping witness statements. Piece by piece, a horrifying timeline emerged. Rena had attended the gathering willingly. A confrontation escalated into a group assault. Multiple girls participated in beating and humiliating her. Then, after the main crowd believed the violence had ended, Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky followed Rena away from the group toward the water. But proving murder required more than rumor. Detectives needed corroboration, physical evidence, and credible testimony strong enough to survive courtroom scrutiny. And that proved difficult because the teenagers involved existed inside a constantly shifting web of alliances and resentments. One witness might implicate someone one day, then retract details the next after pressure from peers. Some teenagers clearly carried guilt but feared becoming targets themselves if they cooperated fully. Others appeared emotionally detached, speaking about the assault with disturbing casualness that unsettled investigators deeply. The emotional immaturity of the witnesses created another challenge. Many of them genuinely struggled to process what they had seen. Adolescents often compartmentalize trauma poorly. Some minimized events psychologically because accepting the full truth felt unbearable. Others convinced themselves Rena survived the second assault because confronting murder directly would force them to acknowledge their own passivity. Detectives recognized these patterns quickly. They were not simply interviewing criminals and witnesses. They were interviewing frightened children trapped inside a nightmare larger than their emotional development could handle. Attention soon centered heavily on Kelly Ellard. Even before formal charges, her name surfaced repeatedly during interviews. Witnesses described her as aggressive, volatile, and deeply involved in the violence against Rena. Some accounts portrayed her as the dominant force during the final attack near the water. Others described her behavior afterward as disturbingly calm. Detectives studying witness statements noticed recurring patterns whenever Kelly's name emerged: fear, hesitation, avoidance. Certain teenagers seemed genuinely intimidated by her reputation. Kelly was only 15 years old at the time of the murder, yet many peers already viewed her as dangerous. She projected toughness aggressively, carrying herself with the kind of confidence insecure teenagers often mistake for power. People later analyzing the case would become fascinated by her demeanor because she did not match traditional public expectations of a killer. She was young, blonde, attractive by conventional standards. Society struggles profoundly when violence emerges from individuals who appear outwardly ordinary. Warren Glowatsky presented differently. 16 years old at the time, he was often described as quieter and less dominant socially than Kelly. Yet witness accounts still placed him directly beside Rena during the final moments near the water. Detectives suspected quickly that both teenagers played critical roles in the murder, though exactly how responsibility should be divided remained complicated. Meanwhile, investigators also pursued charges against several girls involved in the original group assault. The media's phrase Shoreline 6 spread rapidly across Canada, creating public fascination and outrage. The image horrified people: teenage girls surrounding another girl beneath a bridge, kicking and humiliating her while others watched. Female violence especially unsettled the public because it violated comforting stereotypes about gender and aggression. Society expected brutality from gangs, hardened criminals, adult men, not from adolescent girls in suburban Canada. As police interviews intensified, cracks began appearing in the collective silence surrounding the case. Teenagers who initially minimized events started revealing additional details under pressure. Some admitted witnessing Rena being kicked repeatedly. Others described cigarette burns and hair pulling during the first assault. One of the most chilling realizations for investigators was how normalized the violence initially seemed to those present. Several witnesses described the beginning of the attack almost casually, as though group beatings were simply another form of teenage entertainment. That normalization disturbed detectives profoundly because it suggested the murder emerged from a culture of escalating cruelty rather than sudden uncontrollable rage. Investigators also examined the broader social dynamics surrounding Rena before her death. Interviews revealed extensive bullying, humiliation, and exclusion stretching back months. Rena had not been randomly targeted that night. She had been emotionally isolated long before the murder itself. Detectives learned about the insults regarding her appearance, ethnicity, and desperate attempts to fit in socially. The picture forming around the case became psychologically devastating. A vulnerable girl systematically dehumanized until violence against her felt permissible to an entire group. Yet despite growing evidence, the investigation still faced frustrating obstacles. Many witnesses remained inconsistent. Some feared legal consequences for participating in the assault. Others worried about being labeled informants inside teenage social circles where reputation determined survival. Detectives sometimes spent hours untangling contradictions from single interviews. A teenager might admit seeing one attack but deny another despite multiple corroborating accounts. Trauma distorted memory. Fear distorted honesty. Loyalty distorted both. Public pressure meanwhile intensified relentlessly. News stations dissected every rumor connected to the case. Talk shows debated bullying, youth violence, and the moral collapse of modern teenagers. Parents across Canada looked at their own children differently after hearing details from the investigation. The murder struck such a deep cultural nerve because almost everyone recognized pieces of the social dynamics involved. Bullying. Exclusion. Group humiliation. The difference was that in Rena's case, nobody stopped the escalation before it reached murder. Detectives eventually secured enough evidence to move forward aggressively. Arrests followed. Several teenagers involved in the original assault faced charges related to assault causing bodily harm. But the focus remained squarely on Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky regarding the murder itself. When police closed in fully, reactions among the accused varied dramatically. Some appeared frightened. Some defensive. Some emotionally detached. Investigators closely studied their behavior because juvenile offenders often reveal emotional truth indirectly through posture, speech patterns, and inconsistencies. Kelly in particular drew immediate attention due to her demeanor during portions of the investigation. Detectives and later courtroom observers frequently described her as unusually composed under pressure. At times she appeared irritated rather than remorseful. At other moments she seemed almost emotionally disconnected from the severity of the crime. Public fascination with her behavior grew rapidly because people searched desperately for visible signs explaining how a teenage girl could participate in drowning another child. But human violence rarely announces itself clearly through appearance. Evil often looks ordinary until actions reveal it. Behind the scenes, investigators wrestled with deeper questions beyond simply identifying the killers. Why had so many teenagers participated or watched? Why did nobody intervene decisively? Could Rena's death have been prevented if earlier bullying incidents had been treated more seriously? The case exposed failures extending far beyond the bridge itself. Schools, families, peer culture, community awareness. Every layer seemed implicated somehow. Detectives understood this instinctively even while focusing on criminal charges. Rena's murder did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from an environment where cruelty had slowly become normalized. As prosecutors prepared the case, legal complexities multiplied. Trying juveniles for violent crimes always creates tension between punishment and rehabilitation. Public anger demanded accountability, yet the accused were still children legally and psychologically. Canadian courts now faced a horrifying challenge. How should society respond when adolescents commit acts of extraordinary brutality? The legal system itself seemed emotionally unprepared for the symbolism surrounding the case. Courtrooms filled with journalists, grieving family members, frightened witnesses, and teenagers suddenly thrust into national infamy. The emotional atmosphere became suffocating. For many witnesses, testifying meant reliving one of the most traumatic nights of their lives while facing public scrutiny. Some broke down emotionally during questioning. Others appeared numb. Trauma manifests differently in everyone, especially children. Meanwhile, defense attorneys attacked inconsistencies aggressively because the prosecution relied heavily on juvenile testimony. Memories conflicted. Timelines blurred. Witnesses contradicted one another under cross-examination. The chaos reflected the unstable reality of the crime itself. Group violence creates fragmented perception. Nobody sees everything clearly. Yet beneath all contradictions, one truth remained undeniable. Rena Verk ended the night beaten, drowned, and abandoned near the gorge waterway after being surrounded by peers who treated her suffering like entertainment. As the investigation progressed, another disturbing psychological pattern emerged. Some teenagers involved seemed genuinely shocked by the murder's consequences only after media attention exploded publicly. During the assault itself, many appeared emotionally detached from the possibility of death. This disconnect revealed something deeply important about adolescent psychology. Teenagers often possess underdeveloped perceptions of consequence, especially inside groups where responsibility diffuses collectively. Violence escalates incrementally until suddenly irreversible harm has occurred. The participants then confront reality only after the emotional momentum collapses. Detectives recognized this pattern repeatedly while interviewing those connected to the bridge. What began as bullying evolved into mob assault. Mob assault evolved into murder. And somewhere along that progression, empathy disappeared almost completely. By the late stages of the investigation, Sanic no longer resembled the quiet suburban community people imagined before November 1997. Trust had fractured badly. Parents feared hidden violence inside teenage social circles. Students became suspicious of one another. The bridge itself transformed into a symbol of lost innocence. Beneath the legal procedures and media frenzy lingered a deeper societal fear. If children raised in ordinary neighborhoods could become capable of this, what else remained hidden beneath the surface of seemingly safe communities? Investigators eventually assembled enough evidence to bring the case fully into court. But solving the murder legally would prove far easier than understanding it emotionally. Because no amount of testimony could answer the haunting question echoing through Canada after Rena Verk's death. At what point did a lonely 14-year-old girl stop being human in the eyes of the crowd surrounding her beneath that bridge? By the time the investigation reached its critical turning point, the murder of Rena Verk had already consumed the national consciousness of Canada. Newspapers printed new details almost daily. Television crews stood outside court buildings in the cold British Columbia rain waiting for updates. Across the country, parents sat awake late at night staring at their children differently, wondering what invisible emotional worlds existed behind bedroom doors and school hallways. The case had evolved beyond a homicide investigation. It had become a mirror reflecting fears society did not want to confront, bullying so severe it became ritualized cruelty, adolescent violence escalating unchecked. And the terrifying realization that entire groups of young people could participate in dehumanizing another child without anyone stepping forward to stop it. Yet despite enormous public pressure, investigators still faced one major problem. They knew Rena had been beaten beneath Craigflower Bridge. They knew Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky followed her afterward. But proving exactly what happened during those final moments near the Gorge Waterway required something stronger than fragmented teenage rumors. Detectives needed a breakthrough capable of transforming suspicion into undeniable legal truth. And like many true crime cases involving groups, the breakthrough came not from dramatic forensic discovery, but from psychology. Pressure changes people over time. Especially young people carrying secrets too heavy for their emotional development to sustain. In the weeks after Rena's body was discovered, the teenagers connected to the bridge assault continued trying to live ordinary lives while surrounded by growing public hysteria. They returned to classrooms where whispers stopped when they entered. They faced police interviews, suspicious parents, reporters, and classmates desperate for answers. Some became withdrawn. Others grew defensive. Several reportedly experienced nightmares and emotional breakdowns. The collective silence surrounding the murder began cracking slowly under the weight of fear and guilt. Detectives understood this dynamic well. Group crimes often unravel when participants realize loyalty offers less protection than honesty. Adolescents especially struggle to maintain unified deception over long periods because emotional maturity, impulse control, and psychological resilience remain underdeveloped. Investigators therefore approached interviews strategically, applying pressure gradually while comparing inconsistencies across statements. Small contradictions became important. One teenager described seeing Kelly angry after the first assault. Another recalled Warren returning from the shoreline looking disturbed. Others remembered hearing comments afterward suggesting something terrible had happened near the water. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they formed an emerging narrative impossible to ignore. One of the most significant developments came through evolving witness testimony regarding the moments after Rena walked away alive from the initial group attack. Multiple teenagers independently confirmed seeing Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky follow her into the darkness. That detail mattered enormously because it separated the chaotic mob assault from the final homicide itself. Rena survived the first beating. She attempted to leave. Then two individuals pursued her deliberately. Prosecutors recognized immediately how critical this distinction would become at trial. It suggested intent, continuation, and personal responsibility beyond group violence. As investigators tightened pressure, Warren Glowatsky began changing psychologically. Friends and observers later described him as increasingly troubled after the murder. Unlike some others involved, Warren appeared unable to fully detach emotionally from what happened. Detectives noticed signs of internal conflict during questioning. Hesitation, anxiety, emotional instability. His behavior contrasted sharply with Kelly Ellard's more controlled outward demeanor. This difference would eventually become one of the defining dynamics of the entire case. At some point during the investigation, Warren made statements that significantly advanced detectives' understanding of the murder. The exact progression unfolded gradually rather than through one dramatic confession, but his admissions became a major turning point. Warren acknowledged following Rena after the first assault and participating in violence near the water. More importantly, his account implicated Kelly directly in the drowning itself. According to later testimony, Kelly forced Rena underwater while Warren participated in the assault surrounding it. For investigators, this was the breakthrough they desperately needed. The case suddenly possessed internal corroboration from one of the participants. Yet even with Warren's evolving cooperation, the investigation remained psychologically and legally complex. Defense teams immediately recognized weaknesses surrounding adolescent testimony. Teenagers are vulnerable to suggestion, fear, and self-preservation. Statements shifted over time. Memories evolved under pressure. Prosecutors therefore needed additional support beyond confessions and witness accounts. They turned heavily toward forensic evidence and behavioral reconstruction. The physical evidence near the shoreline aligned disturbingly well with the emerging narrative. Rena's injuries reflected repeated assault after the initial group beating. Her autopsy findings confirmed drowning while conscious in shallow water. Blunt force trauma indicated continued violence before death. The timeline established through witness accounts placed Kelly and Warren alone with Rena during the final fatal moments. Investigators also examined post-crime behavior carefully because human psychology often reveals guilt indirectly. Some witnesses later recalled disturbing comments made after the murder. Others described unusual emotional detachment among certain participants. Detectives paid close attention to these recollections because juvenile offenders frequently leak fragments of truth socially before formal confessions occur. Adolescents struggle to contain trauma and guilt neatly. They test reactions, hint at secrets, reveal details unintentionally while trying to appear unaffected. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the case intensified even further once the investigation publicly focused on Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky as the principal suspects. Kelly in particular became the center of enormous public fascination. Reporters analyzed her appearance, behavior, and courtroom demeanor obsessively. The public searched desperately for visible signs of monstrosity because accepting the ordinary appearance of violent offenders feels psychologically threatening. But Kelly did not resemble society's image of evil. She looked like a teenager. That contradiction disturbed people profoundly. During portions of the investigation and later legal proceedings, observers frequently commented on Kelly's apparent lack of visible remorse. At times she seemed irritated by the process itself rather than devastated by Rena's death. At other moments she displayed confidence bordering on arrogance. Whether this reflected emotional detachment, adolescent defensiveness, narcissism, or psychological denial became heavily debated later. But for the public, her demeanor intensified outrage dramatically. People expected horror, guilt, tears. Instead, they often saw composure. And composure after violence unsettles society deeply. Investigators, meanwhile, continued unraveling the broader social dynamics surrounding the murder. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that Rena's death represented the culmination of sustained bullying and dehumanization rather than spontaneous rage. Witnesses described months of humiliation leading up to the attack. Public ridicule, rumors, social exclusion, physical intimidation. Rena had become emotionally isolated long before the murder itself. This realization transformed the case psychologically. Detectives were no longer examining only one night beneath a bridge. They were examining an entire culture of normalized cruelty surrounding vulnerable adolescents. Experts later studying the case frequently emphasized how group dynamics fueled the escalation. Individually, many teenagers involved may never have committed severe violence alone. But crowds change morality. Responsibility dissolves collectively. Aggression becomes performative. Empathy weakens beneath social pressure. The bridge assault reflected these psychological mechanisms with horrifying clarity. Once Rena became designated as the group target, cruelty escalated almost ritualistically. Humiliation fed violence. Violence fed further humiliation. And by the time the crowd dispersed, a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. As prosecutors prepared for trial, another major turning point emerged through the growing divergence between Warren and Kelly's emotional trajectories. Warren increasingly demonstrated signs of remorse and psychological collapse under the weight of the murder. Kelly remained comparatively resistant, continuing to challenge aspects of the prosecution aggressively. This divergence mattered enormously because juries often interpret emotional behavior as evidence of character, even when instructed not to. Warren eventually accepted responsibility to a significant extent, while Kelly fought the allegations relentlessly. The contrast shaped public perception for years afterward. Rena's family endured this entire process under relentless public attention. Every new detail forced them to relive the horror repeatedly. The investigation revealed not only how their daughter died, but how thoroughly she had been dehumanized beforehand. That psychological wound can be devastating for families of bullying victims. They must confront the reality that their loved ones suffered emotionally long before death occurred physically. The Vuk family also faced complicated emotions surrounding their own relationship with Rena before the murder. Conflict, rebellion, misunderstanding all became frozen permanently beneath grief. There would be no future reconciliation now. No adulthood waiting ahead where old wounds might heal naturally. During this stage of the case, Canada itself seemed emotionally divided between rage and confusion. Public conversations around bullying changed dramatically. Schools faced increased scrutiny regarding violence and social exclusion. Parents worried about hidden cruelty inside teenage peer groups. Psychologists appeared on television discussing mob mentality, adolescent aggression, and bystander behavior. The murder exposed something many adults preferred not to acknowledge: children are fully capable of extraordinary cruelty under certain conditions. Society simply feels safer pretending otherwise. As legal proceedings moved closer, the emotional pressure on witnesses intensified severely. Some teenagers reportedly feared retaliation. Others dreaded public exposure. Several struggled psychologically with the realization that they had witnessed a murder unfold without stopping it. Survivor guilt and bystander trauma complicated many testimonies. Detectives and prosecutors had to navigate not only legal facts but fragile adolescent psyches already damaged by the violence they observed. The breakthrough in the case therefore did not emerge from a single cinematic revelation. It emerged from accumulation. Witnesses slowly speaking. Fear eroding loyalty. Forensic evidence supporting testimony. Psychological pressure cracking silence apart piece by piece. By the time prosecutors finalized their case, a horrifying narrative had solidified clearly enough for court. Rena Vek, 14 years old, had been lured into a social environment where humiliation escalated into mob violence. She survived the first assault. Then, while injured and vulnerable, she was pursued into the darkness near the Gorge Waterway by Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. There, beside cold shallow water beneath Craigflower Bridge, the violence continued until Rena drowned face down in mud and water while fighting for breath. Yet even with this breakthrough, the case remained emotionally unresolved in the public imagination. People still struggled to understand why. Why had so many teenagers participated? Why did nobody intervene decisively? How could ordinary suburban children become capable of treating another child like an object to be destroyed? Those questions haunted the investigation because they reached beyond criminal law into something far more uncomfortable: the fragile nature of empathy itself. Under the right social pressures, with enough humiliation and group reinforcement, human beings can convince themselves another person deserves suffering. Rena's murder forced Canada to confront that reality directly. And as the courtroom battles approached, the country prepared to watch not just a murder trial, but a public reckoning with the darkness hiding beneath adolescence, conformity, and collective cruelty. By the time the trials began, the murder of Rena Verk had already become one of the most emotionally charged criminal cases in modern Canadian history. Courtrooms filled not only with lawyers and reporters, but with something heavier: collective grief, fascination, outrage, and fear. Outside the courthouse, television vans lined the streets. Journalists stood in clusters beneath grey British Columbia skies rehearsing updates for national broadcasts. Inside, the atmosphere felt tighter, quieter, almost suffocating. Every person entering the courtroom understood they were witnessing more than legal proceedings. They were watching a country attempt to understand how a 14-year-old girl could be humiliated, beaten, and drowned by other teenagers while dozens of peers circled nearby. The courtroom itself became a stage where competing narratives fought for dominance. Prosecutors sought to prove deliberate murder fueled by cruelty and sustained violence. Defense attorneys challenged witness credibility, attacked inconsistencies, and emphasized the emotional instability of adolescent testimony. At the center of everything sat teenagers who, only months earlier, had been ordinary students wandering school hallways. Now they faced murder charges beneath the gaze of an entire nation. Warren Glowatsky's legal path moved first toward resolution. Compared to Kelly Ellard, Warren appeared emotionally altered by the weight of what happened beneath Craigflower Bridge. During legal proceedings and later interviews, many observers noted visible remorse in his demeanor. He looked less like someone fighting aggressively to preserve innocence and more like someone psychologically collapsing beneath guilt. That distinction mattered profoundly in public perception. The prosecution argued that Warren actively participated in the fatal assault and shared responsibility for Rena's death. Defense arguments focused partly on his secondary role relative to Kelly during the drowning itself. But regardless of comparative responsibility, the evidence against him remained overwhelming. Witness testimony placed him following Rena after the initial attack. Statements and forensic evidence connected him directly to the violence near the water. In 1999, Warren Glowatsky was convicted of second-degree murder. The sentence carried life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after several years. The verdict delivered a measure of accountability, yet little emotional closure. Rena's family sat inside the courtroom hearing legal language attempt to contain the destruction of their daughter's life. Words like second-degree murder, sentencing guidelines, rehabilitation. The justice system necessarily translates human horror into procedural categories. But no legal terminology can fully express what happened beneath that bridge. During portions of the proceedings, the courtroom reportedly felt emotionally unbearable. Autopsy photographs and forensic descriptions forced everyone present to confront the brutality directly. Rena's injuries were described in devastating detail. Bruising across her body, burns from cigarettes, signs of blunt force trauma, evidence confirming drowning while conscious. Each detail stripped away abstraction and returned the case to its horrifying physical reality: a terrified child inhaling muddy water while struggling to survive. Yet the most controversial and emotionally exhausting chapter of the legal process centered on Kelly Ellard. Her trials became a years-long legal battle that consumed enormous public attention across Canada. From the beginning, Kelly's courtroom demeanor fascinated and disturbed observers. Reporters described moments where she appeared detached, irritated, or emotionally unmoved by the proceedings surrounding Rena's death. Society often expects visible remorse from violent offenders because remorse reassures people that moral order still exists. Kelly's apparent emotional distance unsettled that expectation profoundly. The first trial against Kelly ended in conviction for second-degree murder. But legal complications soon emerged. Appeals challenged aspects of jury deliberations and procedural fairness. The conviction was overturned. A second trial followed. That trial ended in a mistrial after jurors failed to reach a unanimous decision. The process became emotionally exhausting not only for Rena's family, but for witnesses forced repeatedly to revisit traumatic memories beneath intense public scrutiny. Every new trial reopened wounds that never truly healed. Witnesses again described the violence beneath the bridge. Again recounted seeing Kelly follow Rena into the darkness. Again relived the terror surrounding the final assault near the Gorge Waterway. Trauma rarely diminishes through repetition. Often it deepens. By the time Kelly faced a third trial, the case had evolved into something almost symbolic within Canadian society. It represented not just one murder, but a broader confrontation with bullying, youth violence, and female aggression. Public debate intensified around rehabilitation versus punishment, especially because the accused were teenagers when the crime occurred. Some argued Kelly herself was a damaged adolescent shaped by violent peer culture. Others believed the brutality of Rena's death demanded severe accountability regardless of age. The legal proceedings forced Canadians to wrestle with deeply uncomfortable moral questions. How should society respond when children commit acts of extraordinary cruelty? At what point does rehabilitation become secondary to justice for the victim? Can adolescents fully comprehend the permanence of murder? Inside the courtroom, prosecutors built their case around witness testimony, forensic evidence, and behavioral patterns following the murder. They argued Kelly played the central role during the final drowning itself. Witnesses placed her directly with Rena near the water after the initial assault ended. Warren's testimony further implicated her involvement. The physical evidence aligned with sustained violence rather than accidental death. Defense attorneys attacked inconsistencies relentlessly. Teenage witnesses changed details over time. Memories conflicted under pressure. The defense emphasized these contradictions repeatedly, arguing the prosecution relied too heavily on unstable adolescent recollections shaped by media exposure and social influence. This strategy created enormous tension because many witnesses were still emotionally fragile years after the murder. Some struggled visibly during testimony. Others appeared numb or detached. The courtroom became a place where adolescence itself seemed to fracture under the weight of violence. Throughout the trials, Kelly remained difficult for the public to interpret. Certain observers saw signs of coldness and manipulation. Others argued her demeanor reflected emotional immaturity, trauma, or defensive detachment under extraordinary scrutiny. But perception matters deeply in high-profile murder cases. The public often constructs psychological narratives around behavior as much as evidence. Kelly's refusal to fit neatly into expected emotional patterns intensified fascination around her. Eventually, after years of appeals, retrials, and legal conflict, Kelly Ellard was again convicted of second-degree murder. The conviction ultimately stood. For many Canadians, the verdict represented a necessary affirmation that Rena's death mattered legally and morally despite the complexity surrounding juvenile offenders. Yet even after conviction, closure remained elusive. There are some crimes where no verdict can fully resolve the emotional damage left behind. Rena's murder was one of them. During sentencing and parole discussions, another profound emotional dimension emerged: the issue of remorse and forgiveness. Warren Glowatsky increasingly demonstrated visible accountability for his actions over time. While incarcerated, he participated in rehabilitation programs and reportedly expressed deep regret regarding Rena's death. Remarkably, members of Rena's family eventually acknowledged his remorse publicly. Their capacity for partial forgiveness shocked many observers because society often imagines forgiveness as weakness rather than extraordinary emotional courage. Yet forgiveness did not erase responsibility. Warren remained forever connected to the murder beneath the bridge. Kelly's post-conviction path unfolded differently. Years later, she legally changed her name to Kerry Sim and pursued gradual reintegration through the Canadian parole system. Her release conditions remained heavily supervised and controversial. Public reaction often remained hostile because many people never believed she demonstrated genuine remorse comparable to Warren's. The divide between their public perceptions reflected larger societal beliefs about accountability and redemption. One offender appeared psychologically transformed by guilt. The other remained emotionally opaque. For Rena's family, however, none of these legal distinctions restored what was lost. Court victories cannot return birthdays, futures, or ordinary moments stolen by violence. The Vooks endured years of hearings, appeals, media attention, and public discussion surrounding the worst event imaginable for parents. Their daughter became known nationally through the details of her suffering. Yet amid that tragedy, they also became voices in broader conversations about bullying and youth violence. The emotional strength required for that transformation is difficult to comprehend fully. The trials also exposed systemic failures extending far beyond the individual defendants. Testimony revealed how normalized bullying had become before the murder. Teachers, students, parents, and communities all confronted uncomfortable truths about cruelty tolerated too long because it appeared ordinary. The courtroom therefore became not just a place of judgment for individuals, but a mirror reflecting societal neglect. Rena's death did not emerge suddenly from nowhere. It emerged from accumulated humiliation, exclusion, social aggression, and emotional abandonment. The justice system could punish killers. It could not easily repair the environment that helped create the tragedy. Media coverage during and after the trials often focused intensely on Kelly Ellard because her image challenged public assumptions about violent offenders. Society struggles psychologically when brutality comes packaged inside youth, femininity, and ordinary appearance. People searched endlessly for visible signs explaining how a teenage girl could hold another child underwater until she drowned. But human violence rarely offers satisfying explanations. Some acts remain horrifying precisely because the perpetrators look ordinary. As years passed, the legal battles surrounding the case gradually concluded, but the emotional impact lingered throughout Canada. The murder influenced discussions around school bullying, youth crime legislation, bystander responsibility, and mental health. Teachers received new training regarding social aggression among adolescents. Parents became more attentive to signs of exclusion and harassment. Rena Vic's death transformed public understanding of bullying from harmless childhood conflict into something potentially lethal. Yet beneath all societal analysis remained the simple human reality at the center of the case. A 14-year-old girl walked beneath a bridge searching for acceptance and never came home again. The courtroom process established legal accountability for those responsible. It documented facts, assigned sentences, and created public records. But justice in murder cases is always incomplete because punishment cannot restore stolen life. The finality of death stands outside every verdict. Long after the trials ended, many people involved reportedly continued carrying psychological scars from that night. Witnesses who failed to intervene. Teenagers who participated in the first assault. Families shattered on every side. Trauma spread outward from the bridge in widening circles affecting countless lives. Rena's murder permanently altered everyone connected to it. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth revealed through the courtroom years: violence never remains contained to one moment or one victim. It echoes through families, communities, and generations long after the legal process ends. Beneath the cold November darkness near Craigflower Bridge, something larger than one life was destroyed. A society's belief in the innocence of its children drowned there too. Years after the murder of Rena Vic, people still drove across Craigflower Bridge every day without fully realizing what lingered beneath it. Traffic continued. Rain still swept across the Gorge Waterway during the cold British Columbia winters. Trees still leaned quietly over the shoreline where a 14-year-old girl spent her final moments struggling to breathe in shallow water while other teenagers walked away into the darkness. Time moved forward the way it always does after tragedy, indifferent and relentless. But some places never completely release what happened there. And some stories refuse to fade because they force society to confront truths too uncomfortable to forget. The murder of Rena Vick remained one of those stories. In the years following the trials, the case evolved from headline into cultural wound. Schools across Canada referenced Rena's death during anti-bullying discussions. Psychologists analyzed the social dynamics surrounding the attack. Criminologists studied the behavior of crowds, bystanders, and adolescent violence. Journalists revisited the case repeatedly because every generation of parents and teenagers seemed to rediscover the same horrifying question: how could this happen? But beneath all the documentaries, articles, legal analysis, and public debate existed something far simpler and far more devastating. A lonely girl wanted desperately to belong. That desire led her toward people who saw vulnerability not as something to protect, but as something to destroy. Rena's story continues haunting people because almost everyone recognizes parts of it. Most adults remember school cruelty in some form. The humiliations. The exclusion. The fear of becoming the person everyone suddenly turns against. Adolescence can be savage long before physical violence enters the picture. Entire social hierarchies are built around identifying weakness and punishing difference. For many teenagers, survival depends on staying close enough to acceptance that the crowd never redirects its cruelty toward them. The murder beneath Craigflower Bridge represented the absolute extreme of that dynamic, but the emotional mechanisms involved were frighteningly familiar. That familiarity unsettled society more than the violence itself. Because if ordinary bullying could evolve into murder under the right conditions, then perhaps the seeds of brutality existed in far more places than people wanted to admit. In the aftermath of the case, educators and parents increasingly recognized that social aggression among teenagers often causes deeper damage than adults realize. Before Rena's death, many forms of bullying were dismissed casually as rites of passage or normal adolescent behavior. Teasing builds character. Kids are cruel sometimes. They will grow out of it. Those comforting assumptions became harder to maintain after the details of the case emerged publicly. Rena had not been attacked suddenly by strangers. She had been emotionally isolated, mocked, and dehumanized over time until violence against her no longer shocked the group surrounding her. The murder exposed how dangerous prolonged humiliation can become when nobody intervenes meaningfully. It also revealed something deeply disturbing about bystander behavior. Dozens of teenagers witnessed portions of the assault. Some participated directly. Others stood nearby frozen between fear and detachment. Very few tried seriously to stop it. That reality forced psychologists and sociologists to confront uncomfortable truths regarding human group behavior. People often imagine they would act heroically in moments of crisis. But crowds change morality. Responsibility disperses psychologically. Fear of social rejection competes against empathy. Individuals become passive because everyone assumes someone else will intervene first. Beneath the bridge that night, that paralysis became fatal. Rena's death therefore became not only a story about killers, but about silence. Silence from peers. Silence from systems. Silence accumulating around a vulnerable child long before the murder occurred. For Rena's family, the aftermath unfolded privately beneath the public attention surrounding the case. Grief after violent loss rarely follows a clean emotional path. It mutates over time. Some days rage dominates. Other days guilt. Then numbness. Then unbearable longing for ordinary moments that no longer exist. Parents who lose children often describe time splitting permanently into before and after. Before the phone call. Before the body was found. Before life became divided by trauma. The Vick family endured not only the loss itself, but the national exposure of Rena's suffering. Millions of strangers learned intimate details about their daughter's final hours. Her pain became public knowledge. Yet despite that unimaginable burden, they